Picture a maximum security prison. You're probably imagining concrete walls, iron bars, maybe an orange jumpsuit. You've seen the shows. You know the vibe. But here's the thing. What you're picturing is a product of the last few decades of television, policy reform, and yes, a few too many Netflix documentaries. Step back to 1948, and the reality of life inside a maximum security prison looks and feels completely different. We're talking about a world still raw from the Second World War, where governments were hardened, economies were rebuilding, and the idea of prisoner rehabilitation was either brand new or completely laughable, depending on which side of the Atlantic you were on. This video is about what daily life was actually like inside maximum security prisons in 1948. Not the Hollywood version, not the sanitized history book version. The real, gritty, day-to-day existence of the men locked behind the most fortified walls in the world. What they ate, how they slept, what they were allowed to say, who they were allowed to be, and what happened when they broke the rules. But before we get into it, if you enjoy history, told the way it actually happened, please consider subscribing to this channel. We're on a mission to reach 1,000 subscribers, and every single one matters. Hit that button, it's free, and it helps more than you know. All right, let's go back to 1948. To understand what life was like inside a maximum security prison in 1948, you first have to understand what the world looked like outside. The war had ended just 3 years earlier. Europe was in ruins. The United States was riding an economic wave, but also living under the creeping anxiety of the Cold War. Society was rigid. Deeply, almost aggressively rigid. Authority was not questioned. Rules were not debated, and the general public had very little sympathy for men who ended up behind bars. This cultural atmosphere shaped everything about how prisons operated. Wardens had near absolute power. Guards were underpaid, undertrained, and often carried the same authoritarian mindset as the military they had just left. And prisoners? They were, in the eyes of the law and society, people who had forfeited their right to be treated with particular dignity. That's the world we're walking into. When a man arrived at a maximum security prison in 1948, the first thing that happened was simple and brutal. He stopped being a person with a name and became a number. At institutions like San Quentin in California, Stateville in Illinois, or Sing Sing in New York, the intake process was designed to strip away identity as efficiently as possible. Your clothes were taken. You were given a uniform, typically a coarse gray or blue outfit that scratched at the skin and was sized more or less at random. Your head might be shaved. Your personal belongings were cataloged and locked away, most of them never to be seen again. You were assigned a cell number, a block number, and a work assignment, usually before anyone had spoken more than 20 words to you. Then came the silence rule. In many American maximum security prisons of this era, talking was restricted or outright forbidden in certain areas. The dining hall, the corridors, sometimes even the work areas operated under what was called the silent system, a practice inherited from 19th century prison philosophy that believed silence would force inmates into reflection and moral improvement. In practice, it mostly just created a suffocating atmosphere where men communicated through glances, hand signals, and whispers that could get you thrown in solitary if a guard was having a bad day. Your cell was your world, and it was small. We're talking roughly 6 feet wide and 9 feet long, about the size of a modern bathroom. If your bathroom also had to serve as your bedroom, your living room, and your psychological sanctuary. A cot bolted to the wall, a thin mattress that had seen better decades, a small shelf, a bucket. Yes, a bucket. Because in many facilities, indoor plumbing inside individual cells was still not universal in 1948. If you needed to use the toilet during the night, that bucket was your option. It was emptied in the morning during what guards affectionately called the slop-out. The cells in older institutions like Sing Sing, which dated back to the 1820s, were notoriously damp in winter and suffocating in summer. There was no air conditioning, obviously. In places like Texas or Georgia, summer temperatures inside a cell block could reach well over 100 degrees. Men slept in their own sweat. Skin infections were common. The smell, by all accounts from former inmates and prison staff of the era, was something that stayed with you long after you left. You had a small window, sometimes. In some older designs, the windows were interior-facing, looking out into the cell block corridor rather than the outside world. Natural light was a privilege, not a given. If there was one word to describe life in a 1948 maximum security prison, it would be monotony. The routine was ironclad and deliberately so. Wake-up typically happened around 5:30 or 6 in the morning. A bell rang, actually rang, a loud metallic clang that echoed through the cell block. You had minutes to dress, make your cot with military precision, and be ready for count. The count happened multiple times a day, morning, noon, evening, and sometimes in the middle of the night. And every single prisoner had to be standing at their cell door, visible and accounted for. After morning count came breakfast. Men were marched to the dining hall in single file, often in silence. The food in 1948 was functional rather than enjoyable. Oatmeal or cornmeal was common. Coffee that was more suggestion than substance. Bread. On good days, maybe an egg. The calories were sufficient. And this is the detail that surprises people, because labor was expected, and a man who couldn't work was a man who couldn't be productive for the institution. Prison administrators of the era understood, in their purely utilitarian way, that you had to feed the machine. After breakfast, work. In 1948, maximum security prisons were not holding facilities. They were labor facilities. Nearly every able-bodied prisoner had a work assignment, and these weren't token tasks. Men worked full days, typically 8 to 10 hours, in prison industries, farms, laundries, kitchens, and workshops. Federal Penitentiary in Illinois, one of the most famous maximum security facilities of the era, had a fully functioning industrial operation where prisoners manufactured furniture, license plates, and clothing. San Quentin had jute mills where men worked looms in deafening noise for hours on end. Some southern prisons still operated on a model barely distinguishable from forced agricultural labor, with prisoners working fields under armed guard. The pay, when it existed at all, was laughable. Pennies per day. Some men earned nothing. The work wasn't framed as punishment exactly. It was framed as discipline, character building, and institutional necessity. The prisoners, unsurprisingly, had a different perspective. One former inmate of Stateville from this period recalled that the only way to mentally survive the work was to find something, anything, that felt like personal ownership. A man who became the best laundry folder in the block, or who quietly took pride in a chair he'd built, wasn't deluding himself. He was preserving his sanity. Every prison system has a mechanism for enforcing compliance. In 1948, that mechanism was, more often than not, solitary confinement, though it was rarely called that. The terms varied by institution. At Alcatraz, they had D-block. At other places, it was called the hole, the box, or simply isolation. The rules that could land you there ranged from serious, attempted escape, attacking a guard, to almost absurdly minor. Talking during the silent period, moving without permission, being caught with contraband, which could mean a playing card, a letter not approved by the censor, or a small amount of food taken from the dining hall. The hole in most 1948 institutions was a dark, bare cell with minimal food, bread and water in many cases, and complete isolation for days or weeks at a time. There was no formal limit, no oversight board, no appeal process. The warden's word was final. Alcatraz, perhaps the most mythologized maximum security prison of all time, operated under a particularly strict regime during this period. Warden Edwin Swope, who ran the island from 1948 to 1955, maintained a rule system so detailed that men were expected to walk on specific painted lines in the corridors. Deviation was noted. Repeated deviation was punished. And yet, and this is what makes the human story so fascinating, even inside this rigid world, people found ways to live. The recreation yard was a release valve, offered for limited hours. Men played baseball, walked circuits around the yard, or simply stood in sunlight. For some, those 45 minutes outside were the most psychologically important part of the day. Libraries existed in many institutions, not lavish ones, but they existed. And men read. They read with a ferocity that sometimes astonished the staff. Education programs were rudimentary but present in some facilities. A small number of men who entered prison illiterate left it able to read, which in 1948 was still a transformative achievement. Religion was actively encouraged, partly out of genuine concern for souls, partly because a man occupied with Bible study was a man not causing trouble. Chaplains were among the most influential people in any prison of this era, sometimes serving as the only conduit between a prisoner and any kind of emotional support. And then there were the letters. Communication with the outside world was heavily monitored. Every letter both sent and received was read by prison staff. But for most prisoners, correspondence was a lifeline. A letter from a wife, a mother, a child, represented everything the walls tried to take away. The reminder that you existed to someone beyond those gates. What did all of this do to a person? The psychiatrists and criminologists of 1948 were only beginning to develop language for what we now understand as the psychological damage of prolonged incarceration. The concept of institutionalization, where a person becomes so adapted to the prison environment that the outside world feels threatening, was not widely discussed. But it was happening, quietly, in cell blocks across the country. Men who had been inside for years developed rigid internal routines that mirrored the prison schedule even when they weren't required to. They struggled with eye contact. They flinched at open spaces. They experienced what one former prisoner described as a kind of shrinkage, not just of physical freedom, but of imagination. The ability to picture a future outside the walls simply atrophied, like a muscle never used. This was not an accident. The prison systems of 1948 were not, by and large, designed to return men to society as functioning citizens. They were designed to punish, to contain, and to deter. Whether they succeeded at any of those goals is a debate historians and criminologists are still having. What is not debatable is what the experience felt like from the inside. Documented accounts from men incarcerated during this period describe a world of relentless pressure, occasional brutality, surprising camaraderie, and an almost desperate hunger for anything. A joke, a piece of news, a warm meal, a letter, that reminded them they were still human. That, in the end, is the story of life inside maximum security prisons in 1948. Not monsters behind bars, not statistics in a criminology report. Just men, caught in a system that had decided, with the full weight of mid-century authority, exactly who they were, and exactly how much of themselves they were allowed to keep. If this story made you think, made you curious, or made you see this period of history a little differently, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below. What surprised you most about life inside these prisons in 1948? Was it the silence rules? The work conditions? The way small things like a letter or an hour in the yard could mean everything? And if you're not subscribed yet, please consider hitting that button right now. We are genuinely working toward 1,000 subscribers, and every person who joins this community makes it possible to keep telling these stories. This channel exists because of people who care about real history, and if that's you, we want you here. Subscribe, leave a comment, and I'll see you in the next one.